Hi, welcome back. And we will now segue into the first of our sessions on specific sectors of the economy. Today, we are going to cover first higher education, then healthcare. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Alfredo Carlos, who is going to give the overview of what's going on in the higher education sector. Dr. Carlos is assistant professor in the Department of Labor Studies at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. He's a co-president and membership and organizing chair of the California Faculty Association at that campus. Before starting at Cal State University Dominguez Hills, he served as the interim director of Chicano Studies, Eastern Washington University, and was a former faculty member in political science at Cal State Long Beach. We're really honored to have him speak today because of his vast experience with what's going on in higher education. After Dr. Carlos is finished, we will have a panel moderated by Dr. Monique Hussein of the Labor Occupational Health Program, who's a member of the California Labor Lab. And she will introduce the members of the panel in addition to Dr. Carlos, who will be working with her in that session. So without further ado, Dr. Carlos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yellen, for the invitation and just a chance to sort of speak with you all. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And as Dr. Yellen sort of mentioned, I work in labor studies, but sort of my trajectory, and I'm really glad I get to talk to you all about this particular topic because as a student, and just, throughout my trajectory as a former labor organizer, having worked in labor and having just worked on 9 different campuses, I get to kind of talk a little bit about what I've seen and what a lot of us, this isn't new to folks that are on university campuses, in the context of, what's happened in higher education over the last 20 years. It actually goes back a little bit further, but basically, what we're really talking about today is the corporate university and austerity. Really, what I want to talk to you all about is the disinvestment in public and higher education. I am involved in my union, the California Faculty Association. We just engaged in the first actual formal strike that we've had in a really long time. And a lot of that is sort of connected to the way in which the university, the CSU specifically, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the California University public university systems today, since that's what we're most familiar with on the West Coast, and they're also the largest. And I think to some degree, the CSU plus the UC are really lead the way in the country for public institutions in a lot of ways. And really what we've seen is a huge disinvestment in public education over the last, I would say 30 to 40 years. But it's become more pronounced as cost of living has gone up in the state of California. And so, in terms of relative, increases in tuition and all of that, it's sort of, it's made much more difficult with having to also stomach the cost of living increases that have just ballooned, especially over the last 5 years. And so the first part of my presentation is really, I know the talk is about workers and workers in higher education, but we can't really talk about that without understanding the sort of the context. UCLA put out a report, the California Post-Secondary Education Commission and the California Department of Finance sort of put out this report. Some of these reports are a little dated. If you look at it, you can see it kind of starts to go up. But we're at a point where I actually heard the last panel end on, sort of talking about budget cuts, where it looks like, that little arrow that was starting to climb back up is starting to go down. But this is basically after declining the state investment in public higher education. It looks like it's beginning to rebound in this particular, view. But if you add the last 5 years, it's gone up a little bit, it's steadied off, and then we're expecting kind of a cliff Everybody's kind of bracing for it. We don't know if it's actually like a serious cliff or not, but the conversations on all the campuses right now are, budget cuts, which means, faculty job losses. And I'll get into that a little bit. But I wanted to get into sort of one, the state disinvestment, but also priority areas for the university. And so I want to talk about first the CSU as an example. And in our contract fights for the California Faculty Association, we were able to do basically during fact finding. We hired Dr. Bunces out of Eastern Michigan University to really go through the books, because one of the things that the university always does when you're involved in sort of labor like negotiations, they always say they don't have the money. And at the same time that they say they don't have the money, the summer beforehand, they had all, and the CSU specifically had, um, like giving themselves ridiculous amounts of raises. Our current chancellor, which the UC names are like switched, our chancellor is basically the one who's in charge of all of the whole system. And she's making close to $1 million a year, plus the fringe benefits that come with that position. Where I think the prior one had made 600,000, and the prior before that was 400,000. So like in a 3-year period, the salary for that position changed, and it wasn't just that one. It was all of the AVPs, all the vice provosts, the provosts, the deans on all the 23 campuses got those raises. And so when we were going to contracts fights, a lot of this information that I'm presenting to you is directly from that presentation that we presented to the mediator, which is really insightful. Main conclusion is that the CSU system, and this is as of 2022, is is in a very strong financial condition. Particularly one of the things I could provide this for folks. It's public information. It's actually on the CFA website. The significant conclusion is that one of the things that they actually care about is the reason that they have so much money that they're not actually using to fund the schools is that they want to increase their bond rating, which allows them to borrow money at a cheaper rate. That's actually the reason why they're creating conditions of austerity on college campuses. Not actually that they don't actually have the funding. And even the funding itself, I mentioned that like the state investment has actually gone down, but they've been able to bolster that through creating their own funding streams and funding sources. So there's two things here. One, state disinvestment, which has forced the universities to actually start engaging in fundraising, and they've done that really, really, really well through all of their sort of what they're referred to as auxiliaries. And what that really amounts to is them charging students more money for services on campus, parking specifically, but bookstores, all of that. And so I'm going to go through some of this really, really quickly, just to sort of give you a sense of kind of, what money's coming in and what money they say that they don't have to spend. This is essentially for the balance sheet adjusted for pensions and retiree healthcare for the whole system. And basically total net assets, the blue is the total assets and total liabilities. And you can see on all three graphs, the DPCUs, those are the discretely presented component units, which are the auxiliaries, the things that when the CSU says it doesn't have the money, it counts its state budget. It doesn't say, hey, look, we're holding money all over here on the side. Their projections of the future are always really based on only what's coming in through the state. But like they know they have access to all these other funds, and they know this because they spend that money. On our campus, to give you an example, last summer, right before contract negotiations were ramping up again with CFA, our campus president from Dominguez Hills, took a $60,000 weekend vacation here in Huntington Beach at a beach resort. And that's just one example of how 3 days they basically spent what amounts to more than the full-time salary of an adjunct professor on our campus. And so all of these graphs are basically making the same argument that that every single year, except for 2009 and 2008 because of the financial crisis, the amount of money that's coming into the CSUs continues to go up. The restricted expendable is what's coming in from the state. The unrestricted is what's coming in from the money-making instruments, money-making machines, institutions on college campuses, parking and bookstores being sort of the primary, but also through donations and through, other sort of selling or leasing land. On our campus, we lease land to Hollywood studios all the time. And so, these are all basically operating cash flows for the CSU. Again, 2008, 2010, like that period is a little wonky, but that's because of the sort of the delayed effects of the financial crisis. But, every single year, continues to go up. And 2022 was actually the best year on record for the CSU, in the context of, how much money's coming in. In terms of like, and this is actually like the point I made a little bit earlier is for what? Like, what's the purpose of hoarding all this money? I think the result is that we were able to find through this fact-finding process was that the CSU has $2 billion in reserves and $8 billion in investments. And they're just sitting there growing these investments and growing their reserves. And they keep saying for a rainy day fund, but we have rainy day funds. We have had rainy days consistently. Had issues with like just students, enrollments ballooned. We needed money to like fund more classes, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of stuff on campus that I'll get into in terms of how this creates conditions for workers. Give me a second. I see something in the chat. I want to just make sure that okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a like tech thing. And so basically over the last 30 to 40 years, there's been a heavy reliance on sort of, bringing in money from the state, saying we're cash poor, we need more money. And then when they get the money, they actually don't use it for, serving students and for their faculty or things that students need on campus. And so this creates sort of working conditions that on college campuses that are difficult. And at the same time, in a similar period as that, where there's this disinvestment in the actual educational process and everything that comes with it that I'll get into in a little bit. There's also the growth of the university bureaucracy and administration in the CSU. Over the last 20 years, we've seen universities hire much less faculty per student ratio and a much more administration and sort of bureaucracy and bloat. And so, this is from that same report. The CSU expense distribution from 2019 into 2022 is basically that green area is institutional support, what they call admin. 33% is going to almost 34% is going to instruction. But that green area has expanded over the last 10 years. This is where it's currently at. This is basically the change in expenses from 2019, even over the last 5 years, how much money has gone to institutional support, the green area again, which is at administration, has ballooned upward. Student services, which we're grateful that we're finally investing in student support services. But one of the things that I always discuss as somebody who's worked at 9 different universities in various capacities is that the faculty are really the frontline people when dealing with students. We're the ones that see them every single day. We're the ones who know when something's wrong with one of the students. And so the fact that we're funding student support services and programs that largely don't even connect with faculty, I think it causes sort of an issue for faculty rather than just supporting faculty outright. I'm not saying we shouldn't provide those things, but there needs to be a better sort of connection. And then you can see the rest of it, maintenance of the plants. I'm going to talk a little bit about deferred maintenance that the CSU has, buildings that are, just when it rains, like brand new buildings even, that when it rains, they get flooded. And there's all kinds of issues in terms of like, them just holding on to this money rather than putting it to use for folks. This is sort of the change in employee. Another biggest category of increase is executive management. Clearly, it's grown by about 6% over the last 5 to 6 years. And it's really the only one that is growing. All of the other ones are, you can see they're mostly in the they're all in the negative outside of lecturer or faculty. And the lecturer faculty is one that's happened over the last sort of 30 to 40 years, which there's been a huge move where, 40, 50 years ago, lecturers were supposed to be like experts in their field that teach one or two classes, from time to time. And there's been basically an impoverization of the professoriate, the profession, to rely on contingent labor, to rely on part-time labor because it's cheaper. At the same time, we're hiring many more admins to basically hold meetings all day long, and and I'll talk a little bit about that. Actually, I'm going to say it. And sorry, this is the percentage in the CSU of, and this is only to 2014. It doesn't even take into effect the numbers. This is I was trying to get some visuals for you all to sort of kind of see this. But this is basically from 2004 to 2014. That black line is management, and it's actually gone up higher since then. And then if you want to see it per campus, this is what it looks like for campus. Channel Islands is actually the only one. Red means faculty, and black is management or admin. And basically every single campus, since 2004 has hired more admin, percentage wise, more admin than faculty in terms of sort of per capita or the growth in that particular field. Channel Islands is unique because that was a campus that basically broke off from Cal State Northridge and actually became its own campus and needed to hire much more faculty. And this is sort of the rest of that slide. It's basically, we're hiring, universities are becoming administrator, heavy. And this is similarly sort of seen in the UC. I only have a couple more slides. This is 1993, 2013. Again, the recent data, I wasn't able to sort of find something that was sort of simplified, but it mirrors this. Talking to colleagues and folks in those places, it's the same. And a lot of it is actually hiring for development purposes to bring in more money to universities that it uses for sort of side projects. And sort of, this is another way to visualize that per campus. This is the growth of administration on each one of those campuses. And so what this really leads to, and I apologize, I went through those really quickly because I wanted to get to this stuff. And if folks have questions, I can also go back to some of those other slides. But what this means for work and workers in higher education is essentially like massive understaffing. And I've been talking largely about faculty, but this goes down to sort of every single level of the university. There's understaffing at the faculty level where you have departments who have to rely on contingent adjunct faculty labor, and so therefore it leads to conditions where less faculty are available to serve on committees because only tenure track faculty are allowed to, serve on committees because they're actually getting paid to do that work, and adjunct faculty are just getting paid to teach. And so it puts a huge burden on faculty to not only now engage the teaching, sort of, to do the teaching plus all this added service. It also sort of leads to other conditions that have just the type of students that we're getting have just changed, and also enrollments. And so but it's not just for faculty. The same can be said for even maintenance and janitorial workers. The universities used to actually have, I remember when I first started going to college, they had janitors go through every office, like on a semi-regular weekly basis. Now they've cut back on all of those services. As a faculty member, I have to take out my trash. Not that I have a problem doing that. I'm, working class person. I've always done that. But these things that like used to exist on college campus no longer do. And so people coming in just are coming into the new context, don't recognize that there's been a change in the types of services and or conditions that people face. Our staff people have to deal with it also. I am in a department that we share between three departments. We share one sort of office manager. And so that adds, even though like we're smaller departments, the fact is that's triple the forms that we have to fill out through her, because each department is still responsible for its own sort of, like processes and all of that. And so like anytime, we have to do a report or an evaluation of some sort or a program review, like it has to go through the same process as, bigger departments, and we have less faculty, less staff to sort of do that. A lot of this leads to burnout, which is one of the reasons why we went on that strike, was because the conditions on our particular campus. But you can see this as a sort of example across the board, across other areas of higher education. Other states are going through the same process, where faculty, and there's an interesting thing here too that I want to highlight, is that the reason that a lot of faculty on other college campuses don't have like union representation. For instance, the UC's tenure track faculty aren't part of a union. They're part of sort of an association, is because of the changing nature of the profession. People in academia 30 to 40 years ago used to, see themselves as not part of the working class. And that had to do with the kind of lifestyle that you can live as a faculty member 30 to 40 years ago. 30 to 40 years ago, if you were a professor, that was, a dignified, and is still a dignified profession. But I mean, the word professor comes from the word profession, which is to be a professional, and you got paid a professional salary, and you got compensated and valued at a professional level, which means that you can lead a, upper working class, middle class lifestyle, which is has eroded really quickly. We have adjunct faculty on our campus and at other campuses who experience housing insecurity. We have, you know, um, staff who have to commute because of the cost of living. I know staff who have to drive at 5, 6 in the morning to get to campus from Riverside, because they can't afford to live in the communities that we're working in. And so all of this leads to, at every single level, from whether it's faculty to staff, to student staff, to maintenance workers, to there's that backlog of maintenance requests. In terms of, if like my light bulb goes out, here, and I put in a maintenance request, it probably won't get fixed for another 2 to 3 weeks, or if I'm lucky. And it's not because of them, it's just because they're understaffed. And so this leads to increased responsibilities. For faculty, it means increased class sizes. So we've seen a growth of our classrooms, which affects instruction, affects how much attention we can sort of provide to students, individual sort of attention. It means us doing more student support. One of the things that's changed also in the last 10 to 15 years is that on-campus student mental health has been massively increased in terms of the issues that students are facing, their mental health issues, that now faculty are having to, in addition to all these other things, are having to figure out how to navigate working with students who are suffering from mental health issues, with reduced counselor loads. That's actually something I didn't include in the slides, but the National Association that recommends the campus counselor to student ratio recommends that there be 1,500 students per one college counselor for students to seek mental health services. And most of our campuses are actually above 3,000 students to one counselor. And so that was actually one of the demands that we requested in our contract, is that the CSU invest more in providing more mental health services for students. And all of this, coupled with decreased resources for faculty, hiring lecturers who get paid very little. This, I won't get into sort of the lecturer life, which I won't get too deeply into it, but I need to mention it because a lot of it is the contingent labor. Is you're piecing together work, that you're hopping from campus to campus. Sometimes you get a full schedule if you're lucky, sometimes you don't. So I know a lot of our lecturers, they don't have the time and energy to like focus on one campus and to actually be present and to be available to students the way that they need, because they have to get to a different community college, and or you see that they're also lecturing at, and that means driving around all day. And so like all of this is just what we're seeing across really the board in all other industries, which is, like the fast pacedness of it all, like, right. Or what, on the factory line would be called speed up. And so this is a version of all of that. And so for a long time, they're saying, oh, we don't have the money for your salaries, but they also have the money for all these other things. And so it became a sort of hypocritical, and clearly hypocritical, that was able to actually allow us to sort of, convince a whole lot of faculty members on campuses to actually engage in strike actions, which historically has been very difficult to get, academics, intellectuals to think of themselves in that, like, we don't go on strike, we just ask for things and we get it. Well, we don't, we haven't historically, and we finally did, and we were able to get a sort of a decent contract negotiation. But again, decreasing real salaries in terms of, we're having a hard time actually recruiting people to all kinds of positions, because they don't pay sufficient amount of, salaries to be able to live in the community that it exists in. We have faculty, I know faculty members who were living in Apple Valley, where Dominguez Hills is in the heart of, the harbor of LA. Apple Valley is like, you're all the way out there by San Bernardino Mountains, and people commute because they can't afford to live in Los Angeles. And this isn't just here. San Francisco State is even worse. San Francisco State is having student enrollment issues, and also faculty recruitment issues, because of just how incredibly expensive it is to live. And there's also institutionally, in terms of conditions for faculty, there's a shift from there has, I mean, CSUs have historically always been teaching universities, but like the way in which professors get promoted is still heavily reliant on, doing research. And so there's a disconnect between what the actual job really is, which is engaging in teaching and student support and student services, and, helping students thrive in their education. And there's a disconnect between what that job really is, which we spend most of our time doing that, and how we get promoted. We get promoted by doing research and what's the RTP process, review, tenure, and promotion, which heavily focuses on your publications and being sort of, research producing university. And so we do both of these things, but in terms of, like how much one is valued over the other, the teaching isn't, as valued, and it sort of it doesn't really make sense. I mentioned earlier deferred maintenance. There's billions of dollars of deferred maintenance that, instead of using those $10 billion that I was referring to that are in investments and reserves, there's massive amounts of just on university, like just like building negligence. I mean, when it rained here in LA, it doesn't rain very often. And so it rained here recently, and it was like, just a regular day of rain. And, ceiling tiles were falling down, like like roofs were being flooded. So like there's also issues with ADA compliance on a lot of campuses, because the universities don't invest the money that is needed there. And all of this is really because of there's misplaced budget priorities. And so the conditions that it creates for workers, one, unsafe working conditions. As union members, we always talk about how, student learning conditions, our working conditions are student learning conditions. This is like the part that's hard, is that it's just because it's really misplaced budget priorities, rather than invest in the students who pay a lot of they're the ones who pay the bills. Rather than invest their money in making the schools better, they have bloated admin who have their own budgets and spend money on, pet projects, rather than actually, funding things that, need to be funded, which is the primary, reason the CSU and universities exist, which is to educate our students and to make them, productive members of our society. And, if you have sort of a limited view, to get them careers. But this isn't to say that there hasn't been, and, I don't want to talk just doom and gloom. I want to get into, the increased sort of unionism. Um, and this is the part that all of these conditions have actually led to, um, because there is all of these conditions which have affected, like all the workers on college campuses and university campuses, has led to increased unionism and solidarity. And so we're seeing right now, we're in this moment where we're seeing, you know, um, like, casts of people on university campuses who historically didn't really engage and talk to one another in any sort of meaningful way. You're seeing people start to do that. So you're seeing coalitions on, campus labor councils. So like now on our campus, we have semi-regular conversations with other labor unions on our campus, and we supported each other, and we're in solidarity with them. So when they're asking for things, they're talking to us to see how we can support them. And so there's increased sort of consciousness around that. Um, and then there's within that, so this all this activity, you have also union leadership who historically isn't used to having engaged membership, not know how to manage engaged membership. And so we have regular one of the things that happens in regular, or not regular, other unions, other labor sector unions, where when you have increased membership engagement, you get into these sort of internal struggles for democratic unionism, where like they don't know how to manage that. And so you have these really, what I think are beautiful, sort of moments of internal struggle where members are trying to get engaged, and people who aren't used to that don't know how to manage that, and also sometimes manage it poorly. And then, you get more member engagement, you get sort of, like the resolutions at, statewide assemblies where, you're expanding the democratic aspect and membership, and the idea of actually like being a member in a labor union. And I'll start to wrap up. I realize my time that went really quickly. Campus labor councils, there's cross-campus solidarity, there's CSU, like there's a lot of connections now. I know a lot more faculty, a lot more of the CSUs, because we're more constant communication. And there's also cross-system solidarity. We support CSU workers, AFT workers, that like we're in like more communication. We recently just started a labor scholar and researcher like consortium that's Southern California based. So like all the, like not just campuses, but any like nonprofits that engage in labor research, sending their researchers out, so we can just be in conversation to see how we can support each other. There's there's also like a national organization that's coming out of Rutgers, who they're trying to connect with adjuncts and lecturers and faculty on campuses, to sort of like have a national consortium of people who historically have just kind of been siloed in just, oh no, we're California Faculty Association, to be in conversation. And this has led to second. This has led to sort of the current moment. The current moment, which I already mentioned and other people have mentioned, is the looming budget cuts in California. Everybody's right now on sort of, oh no, we're going to cut the budgets, and it's really, we're trying to fight is, well, the budget hasn't been cut, so there should be no current cuts. It's okay if you want to plan for contingencies, but our position is like, you're already starting to cut positions, you're already starting to cut classes, you're already starting to cut all these different things, and our budget hasn't actually been cut. And the governor had promised to actually maintain our budget. So like all of that is premature. But at the same time that's happening, there's also this growing university unionism. Just some recent sort of kind of wins is NYU contingent faculty, the NYU agreed to recognize the union. Same thing is happening at Michigan State University, and University of Michigan decided to unionize. University of San Diego and Bennington College are also in the process of unionizing some of their faculty workforce. Within this, there's sort of a debate and a struggle between, should the unions include lecturers and faculty, because historically those two have very similar, but also sometimes conflicting interests. On our campus, on our union, sometimes we struggle with, lecturers versus like, tenure track faculty, and who kind of gets it creates sort of a two-tiered system, kind of the same way that the UPS did a while back. And then, I already sort of mentioned that there's National Solidarity Networks, higher ed, that's what the name of it was, a Higher Education Labor United. There's cross sort of connection. UAW is actually fueling a lot of this because a lot of like, you know, graduate students who went through the UAW 2865 UCLA strikes or UC strikes are becoming professors at universities across the country, and sort of, you know, like going into those contexts saying, hey, like, you know, we need to be unionized as workers. You know, there's increased student worker unionism. So CSUEU organized student workers. And so like all of these conditions are sort of creating all of these, you know, these austerity measures are creating the conditions for increased worker unionism across industries within the university. So within, you know, not just faculty, but including janitors and you know, in those conversations. But basically, that's what we're fighting. We're fighting austerity. We're fighting people who say there is no money, but they have money to spend on all of their pet projects. And I think I'll kind of leave it there, and we can get into it. Hopefully that was kind of helpful to give you some context.
Was indeed. And all of the processes that you described in the Cal State system also apply in the University of California system, where many of us work.